They are creating more realistic identities. They're creating more realistic stories. And ultimately, I think the ways in which victims are being targeted is going to be shifting, right? We see this a lot of times that the reality that is created becomes harder to break down because of the advances in AI that makes it seem more realistic to them.
Hello, hello, all, and welcome back to Good Question, the podcast where we ask all of the big questions shaping the future of fraud, AI, and trust. I'm Brianna Valleskey, head of marketing at Inscribe, and today we're asking, are AI scams the biggest fraud threat yet? We've seen all the headlines about deepfakes, fake documents, synthetic identities, and it is an important issue that we want to talk about because fraud tactics are always evolving, and with new technology, they're evolving faster than many organizations' defenses can keep up. So I'm extremely honored to explore this topic and be joined on the podcast today by two incredible fraud leaders who are facing this challenge from different angles. First, we have Angela Diaz, Senior Principal of Operational Risk Management at Discover. Angela brings deep experience from the banking side where risk programs meet scale and regulatory oversight. Angela, you were one of the incredibly inspirational women I interviewed for our Women in Fraud series earlier this year, too. So I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us. And what is your hot take on AI scams?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm really excited for this conversation. I personally think that we do need to be prepared for how fraudsters might utilize AI, but I think it's going to happen a little bit more slowly than some might think and not as dramatically as we think. I think that we are much better served as fraud fighters focusing on how we can use AI to improve the foundational things that we have in place at our businesses, utilizing it to work smarter, not harder, using it to be more efficient in terms of data, modeling, all of that good stuff. But I think that the greater opportunity is for us to short term, how are we going to use AI? What can we utilize it for in our day-to-day?
That was a very grounded and actionable take, so I love that. We're also joined today by Michael Coomer, Director of Fraud Management at BHG Financial. Michael leads multi-layered investigation teams in the fintech and lending world where scams often show up first. So Michael, welcome. We're very excited to have you on the show today. And what is your hot take on AI scams?
Thank you for bringing us together on this, Brie. I definitely agree with Angela's point here that ultimately I think it's going to be an indirect nature that we're seeing AI used within the fraud space, right? It may not be direct attacks. It might not be changes to how bad actors are using AI to increase the sophistication of their attacks, but necessarily they're supporting their interactions with victims, particularly in a scam environment where they are creating more realistic identities. They're creating more realistic stories, and this generation of essentially posturing and publicity, right? So ultimately, I think the ways in which victims are being targeted is going to be shifting, right? We see this a lot of times that the reality that is created becomes harder to break down because of the advances in AI that makes it seem more realistic to them. And I think that's where we have to focus our attention. A lot of ways in which that we can get ahead of things, as Angela said, is utilizing AI both from a detection standpoint, from investigation standpoints to support that as well, but also our awareness of how it is being utilized to create these false realities goes a long way towards our outreach to victims and trying to break that down, both in a proactive sense as well as dealing with individuals who have already been targeted and have taken these losses.
I really appreciate how you emphasized the effect on victims as well, in that with a lot of these AI innovations, it does create narratives and identities and artifacts that are more convincing when combined all together and layered in with incredibly manipulative tactics. And that aligns really well with three words that come to mind for me, which is love, con, revenge. I think this is an incredibly powerful and insightful documentary. not only in showing how manipulative and dangerous tactic being used to educate people more so they can become aware of these scams, and also it really elevates fraud fighters, helping victims find justice. So I do highly recommend it. Michael, have you seen this documentary?
Indirectly, my wife has been watching it pretty religiously since it premiered. She also works in the industry as well, so try to have some separation sometimes in my personal life. But yes, it goes to that same concept of communication is probably our biggest avenue of trying to be proactive. Publicizing this, it goes some way in terms of protecting potential victims, individuals who may be
Yeah.
susceptible if they start picking up. We talk about, as fraud fighters, as industry professionals, how we look at these situations and to our trained eye, we wonder how could anyone possibly fall for this, or these
Mm.
obviously fabricated profiles, these AI generated images, individuals, girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever partner, it looks so questionable of why someone could fall for that. But something like this that is in the more public mainstream that speaks about it, one, it rationalizes it for some people.
Mhm.
It also breaks down the unwillingness to admit to the situations that might be occurring.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of benefits to this.
I couldn't agree more. I think the documentary is so important. Angela, have you seen this?
I'm 2 episodes in, so
Right.
no spoilers, please.
Okay.
Any episodes beyond 2. I definitely think that these types of documentaries are super important because it's in addition to the proactive customer education that the banks do. A lot of banks are increasing their customer education, their marketing materials when people are opening accounts to make sure that there's scam awareness. They're putting notifications up on their mobile online banking sites, etc. But I think as much detail as possible into what to expect, like being very explicit and transparent with, you might actually get a video, which is a deep fake of someone that you think you know or that you've been talking to. You might get a phone call with a voice that you think is known, someone that you've spoken to. Really sharing what to expect. I think the other challenge that comes along with this is when it is these specific scams that happen outside of the bank. So a romance scam or a phishing scam where a customer is being tricked into giving information or even willingly giving information because of a romance scam, very hard for banks to detect unusual activity because it looks normal. The individual is authenticating and all of that. But what we can do, and what I think we're still accountable for, is thinking about how we can detect this within the banks or the fintech areas. And I think we can also utilize AI for that. So if a customer has never sent wires for 2 years and they're in a vulnerable population, and we could see a pattern of, okay, long-term customer, we believe it's the customer, but they've never sent a wire before. And all of a sudden, for several weeks, they're sending wires where the dollar amount is increasingly growing, or even just wires day after day. There are certain shifts in customer behavior that I think that we can leverage to detect where we might see this type of activity, try to stop it earlier, do customer outreach. That will still come with challenges, right? If a customer truly believes that they're in a relationship, but we should be doing as much as we can and utilizing what we can as financial institutions and fintechs that are accountable for holding this money. So I think that AI and different types of modeling or the way we use data, layering it appropriately, that we could achieve that and that it would have a benefit. And that's one of the things that I was alluding to earlier, in where we can look at some foundational things we've always done. Detecting unusual wire activity is not new to the fraud industry, right? But it might look a little bit differently. We might need to tackle it a little bit differently. Our customer outreach might look a little bit different, and the conversations that we're prepared to have might look a little bit different. But I think that AI can certainly be leveraged in that regard.
You're so on point in that a lot of the ways that AI can help is taking all of the unusual behavior, transaction wire activity, and analyze mass amounts of data very quickly and very accurately to hopefully surface insights or potential risk signals sooner. than ever before. The reason I bring up this documentary is that it does highlight a lot of the effective and therefore popular fraud tactics that can possibly be improved with AI. One person flooded victims daily with selfies, videos, voice messages. Those are things that not only can you be generating with AI nowadays, but then also using an email or text platform to automatically be sending these to people quickly and keeping them engaged in the narrative. These are stories that can be engineered, especially with the help of Gen AI, to spark that urgency and trust. So there's a lot to unpack here. But when we talk about AI scams, what's the first thing that you think banks and lenders should know?
I think that the most important thing is to understand what these scams look like outside of the bank and fintech to the customer in order to understand and predict what it will look like for us internally, because we cannot stop the customer from falling in love with a romance scammer. We can't necessarily stop the customer from giving information throughout some type of scam or relationship building tactic that is happening outside of the bank. We're not there, we're not present, but banks need to not so much focus on what they can't do, shift to what we can do. And we're going to have to think outside of the box. We're going to have to do really what we always do, which is rely on our foundational knowledge of fraud, rely on what it traditionally looks like, what our historical fraud looks like, and to continue to build on it and innovate, because it's going to be a combination. The one thing that I see happening that can be a little bit dangerous is I have seen throughout the industry professionals wanting to skip that part and go straight to, okay, AI is going to be a threat. What third-party vendor can I partner with that will solve the AI part for me? And that's not me deterring us from partnering with our third-party vendors. I am pro third-party vendor. I think there's a lot of value in layering them appropriately. But I think if we skip the part where we look at what we've done historically, what's in place internally and foundationally, and what tweaks may need to happen there in order to strengthen those controls, rules, alerts, models, etc., that we will not be actually solving this in the most effective way possible, because we might be layering on tools that are great, but that don't align with the way that these scams are actually showing up for us. And a third-party vendor cannot make up for a lack of internal controls within any institution. I work for these institutions, so I just know that it needs to be layered appropriately and thoughtfully, constantly monitored, constantly checked for enhancements in performance. And so that's the thing that I get worried about. Is the industry truly understanding full risk management and how we will tackle this in order to do it in the most effective way possible?
Absolutely. Anytime you want to implement a new technology with foundational systems, you have to understand the strategy first, where you're vulnerable, where you can actually, where there's actually really strong use cases for AI. It's not like a one size fits or fixes all. Michael, tell us about what you think is important in the fintech and lending world for risk and fraud leaders to focus on.
I think it's very similar in the same vein that Angela already established. I think there is a requirement for us in the financial industry and financial professionals to reconsider and reframe our assumptions and hesitancies around what we classify as good customers. I think there's a lot of unwillingness to say that first party fraud necessarily exists within your given customer base. And that becomes an even harder obstacle to overcome in the relation to scams. I think there was a recent article that I was reading from payments.com. They cited a survey that said there was a 27% of all bank losses in 2024 were related to scams. That's up from the same survey that said that was 13% in 2023, right? So we have an over 100% increase. And then we have to think about how much of it is going unreported, right? How much is minimized due to the unwillingness or the inability necessarily to adjust our definitions of fraud, in that we are still only scratching the surface of what that actually constitutes and what that entails, right? So we have to look internally at ourselves. I think that's an important part of, as fraud professionals, of how we classify fraud, how we classify behaviors, and it goes towards, as Angela said, of understanding how we can utilize technology to better identify things in proactive manner, early identification of changes in behavior and patterns, and recognizing that while it is a good customer that you may have a lengthy history with, we're talking months, years, whatever have you, decades in some instances for larger traditional banking institutions, that sudden change is significant. It has to be material and it has to be recognized as you can take action in advance that will save you in the long run, save the customer in the long run. We're always worried about creating friction that could turn someone away, but inaction is worse, right? And that's biggest problem is there is still, I think, a fair amount of hesitancy, a conservative nature in our industry, and an unwillingness to potentially turn away customers and ruin a relationship while not recognizing that relationship is ruined if we allow the activity to continue and to get worse.
You just brought up something that I'm going to call back all the way to Fraud Fight Club last year.
Yep.
I spoke on the first party fraud panel, and one of the things that stood out to me was still referring to first party fraudsters as customers. And I said, once a customer commits fraud, they are now a fraudster. And something else that was really eye-opening was after the panel, when I stepped off the stage, how many fraud leaders came up to me being very open and honest about, I don't even know my first party fraud numbers. I haven't even been tracking that. I don't even have the data for that. And that's extremely important. And that brings us back to AI and how we can utilize data. A lot of the leaders were like, oh, I'll have to create a drop down or to create an attribute to track this, or to Michael's point, an unwillingness to want to like label these as fraud, or how do I even tackle it, or not wanting to turn off a legitimate customer. I think it's really important for us to remember that once a customer commits fraud, if in fact it's not obviously a legitimate customer, that's a victim. So I want to make sure I reiterate they're in a different category. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. But first party fraud, also the numbers for the industry professionals that are tracking it, back to Michael's point, are astounding. I had one industry leader that told me that was the largest pool of fraud for them once they actually dug in to being able to track it. They partnered with a large company that helps them. So I definitely think first party fraud is something that we cannot ignore as an industry, that we have to be unafraid to label it, track it, take action on it. And I think if we need a quick way to do that, if we are at an institution that just really hasn't been equipped to do that and they need to do it quickly, AI can certainly be leveraged from a data analysis standpoint in those circumstances to pull some numbers. If you don't know your numbers, you don't know where your problem is, and you don't know how to solution it.
I also felt that way too at Fraud Fight Club. A lot of folks were saying that it's difficult to measure and track that. And we see that too at Inscribe. One sort of data point that we look at on the document is, have they edited non-identity details, specifically financial details? And we can do that because we put bounding boxes all over the different parts of the document that we're looking at. And we do see typically about 40% of our documents that are altered have only the financial details altered. I'll say that mostly we're looking at financial documents, not ID documents, but still, it's always very interesting and telling. And that leads into where AI can create sort of these artifacts that are either more enhanced in how realistic they are or purely fabricated. Angela, what artifacts do you think banks will be seeing or might look out for as we start to see more AI tools being implemented by fraudsters?
I don't know how much I think fraudsters will use like AI for full documentation, but from a first party fraud perspective, I think the industry is definitely going to see it on financials. People that want to create a certain vision of their financial situation on paper because they want to get approved for a mortgage, things like that. That's where I think we're going to see it the most. I think eventually, will we see that evolve into more? Yes. But back to my original point, I don't think we're going to see it super, super quickly because I think we've chatted about before the efficiency and learning curve for the
Yeah.
fraudsters around how to use AI, right? It's going to take them a long time, I think, to figure out the best way to use it or the most efficient ways to use it. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. So if they're already able to be utilizing what they're utilizing, then I think we're going to see AI creep in subtly from a documentation standpoint. I think we also will probably see it on checks because of how much we're doing mobile deposit, and you're not bringing a check to a bank anymore, really. Most of the time, I would say we're doing online banking and mobile deposit. So I think we're going to see it creep in there. It's just, how are we going to see it creep in?
I love that you called that out as well. And you've mentioned this before. Fraudsters like to take the path of least resistance. And that's what we've found as well. The path of least resistance in the document fraud vector is to just purchase a template from an online store. So rather than spending some time, maybe there's one clever fraudster who's going to spend a couple of days using Fraud GPT to create some realistic documents, but more likely than not, then they're going to be posting them to a template store. So most fraudsters are not going to be creating them themselves, because what we have seen too is that purely AI created documents, like from scratch using image generation models, they look too polished or they have, weird text.
Hyper realistic.
Hyper realistic. Yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. It's like almost uncanny valley like
Yeah.
feeling. We have seen some convincing documents that we're kind of classifying them more as AI edited. So a user will take a real document and use Gen AI tools to tweak just a few little bits and pieces on there. Our systems still catch most of these, both the AI generated and the doc store template.
Incredible.
Know that, yeah, it's something we have to track and monitor constantly, but we've seen a huge uptick in the first half of this year on both of those types of documents.
Yeah, I think we should expect to see AI used to actually generate entirely fictitious documents or more non-standardized formats. So anything along the lines of like invoices. That's an easy one where
Yeah.
you can give a relatively minimal prompt into a system that will create a pretty realistic looking document. And then you have to determine, well, where's the line between someone actually using that to create invoices in a legitimate sense or ones that are created just for the purpose of manipulating or miscategorizing their actual financial status. Going back to what Angela said again, your more formal, traditional financial documents, that's where, as called out already, we're going to be relying on template websites, right? Actual marketplaces that, and I think for you actually had an article recently with Inscribe talking about the SEO search engines that are showing like the rate at which people are just putting in a simple Google prompt of fake pay stub, fabricated pay stub template, easy manipulated, anything along those lines, right? That's the path of least resistance. That's where it's the most user-friendly option for them. And that's where we're continuing to see that propagate within our bad customer populations. I think that, again, ultimately, it's something that we, at this point in time, are not noticing a major uptick in the rate of AI generated documents. It's still more on images, I think, is where people, and again, that's where a lot of the headlines are talking about the improvements and the increase in authenticity of images. So that's what people are drawn to.
Yeah.
There's not a lot in terms of talking about this, thankfully, that the advances in AI document creation or generation is still kind of lagging behind, right?
Yep.
And I think it's probably going to be some time because there's more that's required from the end user to feed the prompts, to feed the parameters or requirements to create a more comprehensive document. right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily going into a bank statement that already exists for first-party fraud. Maybe you can see it there, but you also have to think about what is the individual themselves trying to change. If they can just go into a PDF editor and change a single transaction, that's probably something they can do directly. And again,
Tools. Yeah.
they don't know that we have tools such as Inscribe to actually catch these types of manipulations. And they also rationalize to themselves that it's okay to add $300,000 to your daily balances. That's just, I have the money available to me at a different time. It's just, I took a downturn for this month. So I just want to, we're just going to round up by a few $100,000. It's totally reasonable. You can follow any thread on Reddit when you look at people, again, not to reiterate the point, but rationalizing the behaviors and the activity in the same way that we talk about the unwillingness or hesitancy from financial professionals to classify things as fraud. Abuse, for some reason, we say, oh, this is a good customer that's abusing their account. Right?
Yeah.
That is probably one of the worst perspectives that we can take.
Yes. Have an
as fraud.
That's my risk management tip of the day as well, is if you don't have exit customer strategy documented that is based on analysis of customer behavior, you need to get one documented so that you can take action on that. And to piggyback off what Michael was saying, I think we're going to see AI come in subtle quality improvements, or maybe not subtle quality improvements, things that are not visible to the naked eye of our boots on the ground fraud investigators as easily, right? Because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you could spot a fake passport or a fake driver's license that was sent in. It looked so digitally perfect that you were like, get out of here. Or it was a bad Photoshop job and you were like, get out of here. I think that a lot of the phishing emails and phishing texts were easier to spot 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There were some major quality issues, grammar, spelling errors, just low quality logos. There was indicators that were much easier. I think we're going to see that quality possibly go up with AI a little bit, but then our counter needs to be, how can we use AI to detect that if the naked eye of our investigators might have difficulty? Because a lot of these get pulled into queue for manual review, where, like I said previously, major red flags everywhere, easy decision for an investigator or an analyst, maybe now not so much to the naked eye.
Yeah, absolutely.
For our customers, if they're receiving the phishing emails and texts, something that maybe wouldn't have gotten by a large portion of the population now might really cause people to question, like, wait a minute, this looks like it could be legit. And that's what the fraudsters want.
Absolutely. I am actually going to show you guys a few deepfake documents right now so we can look at them and see a little bit of the examples of all of the things we just mentioned, like parts where it's realistic, parts where it's not. So the first one we're going to look at here is this Apple receipt.
Yep.
So I want to hear what sticks out to you guys in this receipt.
I think for me, it's the fact that the text doesn't shift with the wrinkled paper itself. So there's no variability in the clarity of the text itself. So you create these characteristics by having it show wrinkles and perforations and everything else like that, but nothing else moves with it.
Yep.
Right? The shadows around it are very flat. It tries to mimic a three-dimensional object or the illusion of a three-dimensional object, but it misses that. But again, this is from trained professionals looking at it.
Yes.
As well. We are looking at it from going in expecting there to be something wrong.
And people with 15 years, 20 plus years experience versus an entry-level fraud analyst that maybe has 6 months experience. For me, And looking at this, Michael pointed out pretty much everything, but it's definitely the instant standout for me is the pure lack of actual realistic 3D depth to it. It looks very flat. You've got some shadows, but it still looks flat. You've got some wrinkles, but it still looks very flat. It's crinkled, but there is no lift to it or anything like that. It's still too perfect for sure, but we are trained and we know exactly what we're looking for, even for the sake of this exercise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The sort of perceptual signal, I think, of the receipt, like the offness of about it, the lack of shadows that you guys both talked about is, I think, the biggest flag here. What also sticks out to me are just things like the total jumps from 799 euros to like 2,799 euros. We checked there is no Apple store at the address that's mentioned up here. And then also when you see anything like 1234 in a credit card number, we've noticed that comes up in a lot of these AI created documents.
Yeah.
This is an ID we've created. This is supposed to be a British driver's license. Curious if anything sticks out to you guys here.
This one's actually really good. And I'll tell you why it's really good is the glares. Those glares are very good glares. They add a little bit more of the realistic kind of three-dimensional depth or the realisticness of this actually being physically in an environment, having a photograph taken of it. What stands out to me a little bit as off is definitely where the hand is supposed to be meeting the document. That does not look realistic to me. The thumbnail looks realistic, but then where the cards are meeting the hand and it's supposed to be being held, that looks quite off. And then the angle of the documents also looks off to me, where that would cause me some pause. Martina's name, her photo, those details is a little bit too clear and perfect.
Yeah, I think with it, the image itself looks more like a professional headshot than it does a ID image.
Huh.
And as Angela said, the angles of the cards are just not quite right.
Yep.
They just blend away at non-traditional or non-regular kind of angles where, yeah, it just cuts across and the text continues over, right? So there's characteristics there. I think the hand also, obviously, as Angela already pointed out, where it just doesn't seem to line up correctly of the overlap there.
Yep. LLMs are famously bad with hands.
Yes.
So that totally lines up. And
Absolutely.
then the text is also the last thing that sticks out to me here. It's supposed to be UK passport, but this is just gibberish.
It's like the lorem ipsum websites where it's just this generic text that's
Random
filled
pattern.
in. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
completely
so-
randomized.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, one last one. This is an ADP pay stub. This is definitely one of the most sophisticated ones. And I have to give my general disclaimer. All of the names, personally identifiable information, it's all fabricated or it was given with consent. So this is the one that we've been able to recreate that has been most convincing so far. And I'm curious if there's anything on here that sticks out to you guys.
It definitely looks too perfect. It looks as though it's supposed to look like an actual physical piece of paper, not like a PDF or a digital image. And if that's the case, then it looks too perfect for a piece of paper. You would expect to see some type of smudging, folding, some indication that this physical white piece of paper has been handled by a human. And I don't see that here at all. So that stands out just at a glance.
Yeah.
I also obviously am a glasses wearer, so I cannot see the fine print as well. That's my disclaimer to everyone there.
As a fellow glasses wearer, I have the same challenge. Michael, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think that, as you said, Brie, it's actually one of the better recreations. I think it actually lines up really well with a traditional digital ADP pay stub. And obviously, as the kind of market leader, we see these an exorbitant number of times. But when I think about this compared to what you would see from a document generator, from a template store, it doesn't have a lot of the characteristics, a lot of the obvious indicators that are present there. So it makes it that much harder to necessarily identify what I would, if I was looking at this from an investigation standpoint. We go back to looking at the metadata on
Yep.
how the document itself was created to necessarily identify, should we accept this or do we need additional documentation, right? This is one of those situations where even just looking at it, I actually think it looks pretty damn good.
It does.
Um,
It does.
yeah. If this was a trick question, I would not be
I know.
surprised.
'Cause we're also going
Either.
into it, we're going into this review with the assumption that it's not real. But if we were actually looking at it as an investigator, would we
Yep.
pause? Because we also have to remember too, investigators usually have a recommended time frame that they would spend reviewing something.
Yes.
That's just a part of the business. So if an investigator is being held to some, or an analyst is being held to some type of metric and the volume is high, this might be one that they are just like, this looks good and justifying spending more time on it, I really can, and they might go forward. So that's kind of something to remember as well.
Yeah, I think about like how we use third-party vendors and creating rule sets within
Mhm.
the system that checks against those features that should or should not be present within a given document. To Angel's point, we can't check every detail within a limited time frame to determine, is there enough reason to look at things. So it always goes back to scalability.
Mhm.
And to stay on topic, that's where AI will hopefully and necessarily continue to support our capabilities, is by increasing our identification rate at higher levels of scale and making up the limitations or the learning curve, the separation between someone who is more experienced versus someone who is early on in their career.
I would love to dig in more specifically on a use case that your team is using today for AI in your workflow, Michael, which is to have Inscribe embedded. You've previously mentioned that document fraud, even pre Gen AI, was one of your team's hardest loss vectors, especially because manual reviews require the skill set and repetition that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's funny to bring that up because we just had a situation where we had to look back at
And
decisions that were made before, early on in the kind of introduction of our department, where Inscribe wasn't as embedded within our investigation workflow. And we were relying on still informed decisions, but decisions that are made independently at an individual investigator level based on, again, limited information. We're always making decisions on only what is in front of us. We had a decision at the time that was based on a scanned image of an ADP pay stub that was missing some key characteristics that you would necessarily expect to see. So there were decimals missing from the document. The problem with that is actually present in some physical ADP check stubs. So it was an assumption that was being made, and we didn't have an additional tool in place to validate, as well as the actual investigator themselves were not as familiar or as trained up as we necessarily would want to be. So they were working on limited time. We were working in an environment where, as you alluded to, we were facing a extremely significant high level of losses due to manipulated documents. As we have matured over the last few years, we continue to see the growth of first-party fraud and document manipulation driving a lot of fraud attack vectors. That's always been one of the major components of our negative population. We use Inscribe both as a detection as well as an investigation within funnel. So lives in a variety of components throughout our life cycle, but it's hugely beneficial of not relying on humans, not relying on individuals to have that available time to evaluate the authenticity of a document that, again, at the sales level, at production perspectives, they have to go in and trust in the individual that they're speaking to be able to sell them on the opportunity to work with us. They can't go in assuming that is contradictory to what they're trying to do. So to be asking your non-fraud professionals to be calling out red flags, that really is a difficult dynamic to balance out. You either go one end of the spectrum or the other, right? You're either flagging at an unrealistic rate, you're creating undue friction on good customers, you're having sales professionals trying to balance out where they might be
Yeah.
inclined to be accusatory. And you'd never want to create that scenario, you never want to put them in that position. Whereas if you have a system like Inscribe running on the back end that can triage, that can flag accounts in a non-direct way,
Mm.
right? And then filter it into your risk teams, into your fraud teams, that they then can utilize it to say, hey, based on these signals that are generating, do we feel comfortable? Or does this meet or exceed our risk tolerance?
Mhm.
And then understanding that you can apply that same system, same tool set to additional secondary documents. So it's always about creating additional layers to ultimately feel like you have enough to approve or deny.
We're always working false positive rates in
Yeah.
Yes,
always.
100%.
Always. That kind of goes back to like, we're going to see foundational stuff we've always seen, but in a different way. But we always have to be careful with our false positive rate. One, the customer friction. Two,
Mhm.
we're going manual to disposition. Do we have the workforce to do it properly and quickly to where we're not holding up legitimate transactions and money movement? So I love that Michael brought that up and said it because it really brings it all full circle to how we started the conversation as well.
One of the things that we love about Inscribe is that it takes more of the subjectivity from whoever the individual person is. Our models are trained from all of the documents across our network. So if another of our customers has seen the same document, we're able to flag it instantly and you don't have to rely on one person.
Yeah, it's hugely valuable because when I think about the difficulty for individual investigators, going back to the idea of making informed decisions with limited information, we talk about how we're going in already looking for something to be bad. So you convince yourself that these minor differences, these minor variable instances are sufficient. That may not be the case. And there are incentives to make a decision, whether it's necessarily directly pushed in some way of incentivizing someone to make more declines.
Mhm.
But there is an instance of we want to protect the house, we want to avoid taking losses. So that's inherent in our positions. So moving that away from, Bria, as you pointed to, of objectifying the process and taking out the
An
motivations
element.
behind the decisions.
Yeah.
Yep,
You're removing the human element.
exactly.
Somebody could very well be like, I got feedback my approve rate was too high last month. I got
Right.
feedback my decline rate was too
Yeah.
high last month. They're second guessing themselves, right? There's all
Yeah.
sorts of human elements that come into play that AI can remove for us. And we have to be realistic that we want to make accurate decisions, but I keep bringing up that we have to make accurate decisions quickly. We have to do
Yep.
it quickly. And sometimes fraud can be a highly manual world. So I think that AI will help solution that. And specifically some of the things that Michael mentioned that Inscribe is able to mention can really help in those areas.
Absolutely. Well, there is no doubt we could talk about this all day. But for the sake of our audience and for the both of you, we're going to move on to our lightning round, which is just what's your last word or words for the fraud fighters in our audience today? Michael, I'll go to you, and Angela, you can wrap us up.
Yeah, I think again, we touched on it a lot, and I think it was the opening kind of point of conversation was humanizing the victims of a lot of fraud and scams that are currently becoming a larger part of our overall environment. And when we think about bad actors, necessarily and particularly in pig butchering scenarios where there is human trafficking that is serving as the foundation of this. It's not just the victims domestically that are being targeted and losing their financial standing, but it's the individuals who are being forced into indentured servitude, labor, slavery, etc., it is horrible. So I think it's continuing to communicate this, to make it mainstream,
Yeah.
to make it be a very public conversation and a public point of discussion of how broad this has gotten, how much expansion there is, particularly over the last couple of years.
Remember to lead with empathy. I think it's easy sometimes to say the customer fell for it. That's not our problem. We can't do anything about that. So I think it's important to lead with empathy. I think it's important for fraud leaders to remember what we can do and not focus on what we can't do. So staying solution oriented. And I think being prepared for an accountability shift also. I think that there is going to be much more accountability on banks and fintechs to have the right fraud risk management in place, to be able to prove in litigation that they have the right controls in place, and to make sure they're doing right by our customers, because our customers trust us with their money. So we are accountable for it. So I think those would be the three things that I want to drive home, and that I've been trying to drive home a lot this past year.
That gave me chills. I can't add anything onto that. So, Angela and Michael, thank you both so much for this really insightful and empowering conversation. And to the fraud fighters in our audience, if you want to dive deeper into AI and scams prevention, check out other episodes of Good Question. Feel free to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn, because at the end of the day, this is how we move forward, by staying curious, staying solution oriented, sharing this knowledge, and asking good questions. Cheers, everyone.